let's focus now on energy and energy transfer in ecological systems. We'll start off with this discussion of trophic levels and what they are. Trophic levels really defines each step within a food chain or each component of that of a food web or a food pyramid. So when we get to talking about food chains, we oftentimes refer to like where an organism fits within that food chain, then we give them a definition, and those definitions are the specific trophic levels. It's also important to understand the term biomass. What biomass is the amount of living material or organic matter of each step within a food chain or each step within a food web, or how much is in each trophic level. So I think it makes sense to take a look at this food pyramid here. And specifically, it's in the pyramid shape because when we talk about the amount of energy and the amount of biomass available at each level, each trophic level, it's much wider at the bottom and it becomes more narrow at the top. So our primary producers at the bottom here, these are going to be our plants primarily. And these are going to be the largest trophic level. And they're going to have access to the most biomass and the most amount of energy. As we move up a level from that to our primary consumers, these are going to be organisms that eat the producers. If you take a look at the numbers over here on the right, notice how the numbers change. Over here on the right-hand side, we start off with 20,000 kilocalories of energy. So just it's an arbitrary amount of energy. But notice how much of that energy gets transferred to the primary consumers. That's 10%, meaning 90% of this energy is lost, primarily as heat out to the environment. It's also lost in the processing of this food and just these organisms living their daily lives. But of the 20,000 units of energy, only 2,000 then makes it to the primary consumers. The secondary consumers is our next trophic level up. These are consumers that eat either here at the primary consumer level, or they could even potentially eat down here at the producers. So this first level, these are all herbivores. This level here is at a minimum omnivores, so they can eat either plants or animals, or they could be carnivores as well. But notice the quantity of energy now. Now we're down to 200. As we move to the next trophic level up, it's down to 20, and then finally down to 2. Quick math to do this here is all you have to do is move the decimal point 1 point over to the left. So if I move it, if it was here and I move it 1 over to the left, now I'm at 2,000. From 2,000, I move the point over here, and now I'm at 200. From 200, move it over here, so on and so forth, all the way up. So we need to take a look at these trophic levels. The amount of energy decreases as you go up. So does the biomass, and so does the populations as well. In this food chain here, you got a hawk at the top, and the population of hawks is going to be the smallest in comparison to all of the other organisms available. That should make sense, though, because hawks are dependent upon the things beneath them for food. So you couldn't have more hawks than there are snakes. Otherwise, you would run out of snakes because the hawks would eat up all the snakes. So the bottom of a food pyramid, or the bottom trophic level, is always the biggest, and it gets smaller as you work your way out. Again, here's another look at a food chain, a direct pathway, one by one, the flow of energy and mass or matter from one step to the next. Notice how I didn't include the sun in on this, because the sun technically isn't food because there's no matter that's being transmitted. Yes, there's energy, but in this case, we're looking at only including things that transfer mass. So you've got the plant to the insect to the mouse to the owl, each one with a direct line with the arrow pointing to the thing that's doing the eating. Food webs are a bunch of interconnected food chains. This is where you have multiple food chains put together. So this is how you would map out like a whole ecosystem. So like for example, in this food web here, you have multiple arrows pointing to lots of different organisms, showing that organisms are dependent upon several different types of other organisms for their food. This is also a really great way to show that if you remove one organism, how it can have an effect on every single other organism within that food web. All right, so for example, if I take this fox away over here, the fox goes away. Let's say it goes away due to overhunting by humans. Well, rabbit population is going to go up because there's no longer foxes eating them. Mouse population will go up. So will this bird, the titmouse population, go up as well. So if those populations go up, well, then that means that the buzzard population can probably start to go up because they depend upon mice and rabbits and the titmouse as well for food. But then the plantain population is probably going to go down because more rabbits, more mice means they're going to eat more. So you can see by affecting just one organism, there's going to be this cascading effect across the entire food web where populations all across can be changed. Here's another example of another type of food web. This is an aquatic one, or it eventually works its way to an aquatic one, mixing together both terrestrial and aquatic food webs together. Pretty interesting there. All right, now let's take a look at nutrient cycles, how nutrients can get moved around within an ecosystem. Again, remember what nutrients are. Nutrients are anything that are extracted from an environment that a living thing needs in order to be able to live. The three that we'll look at here are the water cycle, carbon cycle, and nitrogen cycle. Water cycle, probably the one that's talked about most because it's the one that's covered in most science classes. We'll start over here with an open body of water. You've got evaporation. So what's going to happen is the sun's going to shine down on some sort of open body of water. You get evaporation. That water vapor will rise up and then eventually cool, condense, and then it will form clouds. Once in cloud form, it can then come back to the earth through precipitation, rain, snow, sleet, things like that. If that rain falls right back into an open body of water like an ocean, well, then you've got a cycle complete. Let's say, for example, instead that rain lands on land. A couple things that could happen. If it lands on something like rock, it can run off and then it can run into, again, an open body of water. Process can repeat again. If it lands on soil, it can be taken into the soil. From there, there's a couple places it could go. It could soak down into the groundwater through a process called percolation. Now, percolation will then flow. Groundwater does flow and typically always flows and ends up towards an ocean. As it's flowing through the ground here, it's going to pick up minerals and salts from the ground, and then it'll eventually deposit them into the ocean, which is why the ocean water is salty to begin with. Another option too is if the water soaks into the ground, it can be taken up by plants. Plants can then give off water to the atmosphere through a process called transpiration. It's evaporation through the leaves of plants. Plants have tiny pores on the bottom sides of their leaves. They're called stomata, and they contribute then to water vapor putting back into the atmosphere, where again it can condense and form clouds again. In tropical rainforests, there's enough transpiration every day to produce rain clouds on a daily basis. So what do you use water for? Or what do living things use water for? Well, the biggest thing is that water makes up the vast majority in terms of the constituents of every cell of every living thing. In a human, it's somewhere between 50 and 60, up to 70% of the body is made up of cells are made up of water. Here's a bunch of other things listed out in terms of what water does for people inside of the body, everything from forming saliva to helping to deliver oxygen through the entire body system because your blood is primarily made of water. So lots of really important uses for water. Let's talk about the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle, specifically when we look at it from in terms of living things, focuses mostly on photosynthesis and cellular respiration and the cycling back and forth between those two. So we start with photosynthesis, which takes place in plants, and any producer that does photosynthesis, they bring in carbon dioxide, with the key there being carbon dioxide and water. In combination with energy from the sun, they can then make glucose and oxygen. That glucose and oxygen are used as a fuel source in cellular respiration. This can happen in animal, plants, really any organism can do cellular respiration, with the goal of it being to make ATP. ATP is usable cellular energy, which living things use to power all of their cellular activities. So ultimately, this whole process is really, really used to create this as an end product. Anything and everything cells want accomplished, they use ATP for it. The end products of cellular respiration, what's given off by these organisms, is carbon dioxide and water, again, which can then eventually work their way back into photosynthesis to make this a cycle. But there's more than just this photosynthetic process that we can look at in cellular respiration for how carbon is used. Carbon is used in every one of the macromolecules that make up living things. For carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, their basis is carbon-containing compounds. Like this carbohydrate right here, at each junction right here, we would find a carbon. In fact, the name carbohydrates means carbon attached to water. Within fatty acids, these are long chains of carbon bonded to carbon, bonded to carbon. So there's a lot of carbon inside of lipids or fats. Amino acids have a central carbon that's right here with an amino group and a variable group and a carboxylic acid that's attached to as well. So plenty of carbon inside the amino acids, which make up proteins. And then finally in nucleotides, they have a sugar inside of them, either ribose or deoxyribose, that's based upon carbon, as well as nitrogen-containing bases that have carbon in it as well. So carbon is a major constituent of all of the macromolecules, which are what make up living things. Living things are made of these macromolecules. So carbon's really important for living things to make themselves. Here's a look at the whole carbon cycle. You can pick really any point to start with. So let's start up here in the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. It can be brought into plants through the process of photosynthesis, and then a consumer like these cows can then eat those plants. So then now they have the carbon inside of them. They give the carbon back off to the environment through when they exhale out that CO2 after they do respiration. All of this as well can happen inside of aquatic ecosystems because gases can dissolve right into water, just like oxygen can, carbon dioxide can as well. We can also contribute to the carbon cycle through the burning of fossil fuels. There's also some natural processes that will give off carbon dioxide as well, like volcanic activity and things like that. All right, let's finish up with the nitrogen cycle here. First and foremost, nitrogen is the most populous gas in the atmosphere, making up about 80% of the air. And most living things can do literally nothing with that nitrogen that's in the air. There is a variety of bacteria that grows in the soil that can do a process that's called nitrogen fixation. But before we jump into that, let's talk about how living things use nitrogen. Most notably, when we look at plants, plants use nitrogen to develop their chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what makes plants green and what allows them to absorb light to be able to do photosynthesis. So without nitrogen, plants can't make chlorophyll, and then therefore they don't do photosynthesis. In fact, when you put fertilizer down on a lawn, one of the major components of fertilizer is nitrogen inside of it. So you'll notice if you put fertilizer down, the plants will become substantially more green immediately after because now they have enough materials to make that chlorophyll. You also find nitrogen in the amino acids of proteins. And you also find nitrogen in nucleic acids, specifically like DNA. So nitrogen is incredibly important for all living things to make their proteins, which perform cell activities, and to make their DNA, which is what ultimately makes the proteins. Here's a look at the nitrogen cycle, highlighting one of those processes that I just mentioned. Here's nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation happens because of nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live in the soil. So they take this unusable form of N2, and they convert it into usable forms of nitrogen that the plants can then uptake. So once plants, like the grass and this tree, they take that nitrogen up into them, they can be used by the plant then to make its chlorophyll, to make its proteins, to make its nucleic acids. That nitrogen then gets transferred back to other organisms when they come by and they eat it. So if a cow comes by and they eat these plants, they now have the nitrogen inside of them. How does the nitrogen get back into the plants or the soil? A couple of ways. If an organism dies, its body will be decomposed by decomposers like bacteria and fungus. That would put nitrogen back in the soil. Also, excrement, specifically urine from most animals, contains high levels of nitrogen because of ammonia. That would put it back into the soil as well. We need to get nitrogen back into the atmosphere because if we didn't have anything that recreated this, we eventually would run out. There's a variety of bacteria as well called denitrifying bacteria that do denitrification. They put that usable form of nitrogen back into the unusable form of atmospheric nitrogen. So here's again talking about that process of nitrogen fixation, converting atmospheric nitrogen, which is unusable by most organisms, into a usable form by plants. Very common plant types that will do nitrogen or will have nitrogen fixating bacteria on them are plants in the legume family, very specifically soybeans. And it's very common for farmers to grow soy every other year to reestablish high levels of nitrogen in the soil. And to end up, a topic that we talked about earlier in class is the idea of biological magnification. And this is how pollution can build up as you move up a food chain. So organisms that are at the top of the food chain are going to accumulate more pollution and more toxins in them than organisms at the bottom of a food chain. And this is why pregnant women shouldn't eat high levels of fish because mercury, which is a product of burning fossil fuels, can build up an aquatic food chain. So fish at the top of the food chain, like swordfish or tuna or salmon, can have elevated levels of mercury that can cause birth defects in developing babies. So that's our look at ecology.